Welcome everyone to the Southland Power and Nature 30 by 30 February meeting. Thank you for joining us. I know we have folks not only from the Southland, but from around the state. So we appreciate your participation. Today, we are super lucky to have Tina Andolina participating. She and I go way back, probably 15 plus years at this point, but Tina is the senior policy consultant for State Senator Ben Allen, and she's been in this role for about 7, maybe approaching 8 years. And she advises the senator on topics like energy, the environment, natural resources, water, and climate change. She's got quite the background, so we're impressed with not only that, but your application into the public servant field. And you also served, which is one of the first jobs that I knew you do. You did a great job with Senator Wolk. She did some great legislation for the environment. And some of the key things that Tina's been involved with in the past was working on federal wilderness legislation. And so she was involved directly with the creation of the Big Sur Wilderness and Conservation Act in 2002. And then later the Northern California Coastal Wild Heritage Wilderness Act of 2006. So she's been at this a long time. We're grateful for not only your leadership and experience, but your willingness to meet with us today. And what she's going to chat with us about is her boss happens to be the chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee. And so we're going to learn about a little bit what that committee does, as well as the potential for a state bond on climate and natural resources, and the state budget. So Tina, at this point, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll try to be wrapping up this part of the presentation around 11:40. And so she'll chat for a little while. We had questions submitted in advance, so we'll go through those. And then if there is a moment to add questions at the end of this, please type those into the chat, and I can watch for those and ask them as time permits. So Tina, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today, especially folks from around the state who care about natural resources, 30 by 30. This is an incredibly important topic and something that Senator Allen has been very engaged on. He does chair the Environmental Quality Committee. He also sits on the Senate's Natural Resources and Water Committee. He's been on that committee his entire time in the Senate, so we've been able to do some really good work there. Speaking of 3030, that committee, the Natural Resources Committee, has jurisdiction over how the governor and the administration is implementing 3030. And as part of his role on the committee, he and I both went to Montreal this past December to the COP Biodiversity Conference, which was really exciting to participate in and to see the reception that California's delegation received there, and being able to sort of spread the gospel about our 30 by 30 efforts and learn from some other countries and jurisdictions about the work they were doing. It was inspiring, and it was great to see the success coming out of that conference. So 30 by 30 has been something super important to the senator, particularly as it relates to protecting wildlands. And just, as a kid, he grew up right outside the Santa Monica Mountains and going to those mountains all the time with his family. So they're very near and dear to his heart, and is part of what drives him to do the environmental work that he does here. The Environmental Quality Committee, as opposed to the Natural Resources Committee, has jurisdiction over sort of a different set of issues. So there we're looking at things like climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, toxic solid waste. So those types of environmental issues. And then as part of the Natural Resources and Water Committee, we look at habitat, biodiversity, water supply, fire, oil and gas drilling, those other types of issues. So he's been able to take a leadership role in all of the environmental space here in the Senate, which has just really been fantastic. Part of the overlap that you guys are acutely aware of, and we've seen between both committees is the need to both mitigate the impact of climate change on our environment. So reduce emissions, obviously, more ZEVs on the road, more clean energy coming into our system, et cetera. But knowing that we were already seeing the effects of climate change, a big focus of the legislature has also been on adapting and creating resilient communities to ensure we can deal with things like the floods, the fires, the drought, water supply issues, extreme heat in our communities, sea level rise. So that is the other half of the coin that we've been struggling with, which brings me to the natural resources and climate bond. I'm sure many of you guys are aware 4 years ago, the Senator Allen, along with a group from the Senate, introduced SB 45 as a natural resources and climate bond, which would have put, at the time, we were looking at around $5 to $6 billion on the November 2020 ballot to deal with all of those issues. So everything from fire and flood to sea level rise and extreme heat events. And it was, we were able to get that measure through the Senate, and the Senate was able to identify some really great priorities that that we were able to get behind. In the Assembly, Assembly member Eduardo Garcia introduced his version of that and was trying to get his version through the Assembly, which is incredibly important to have those two different vehicles, because in the Senate, we can organize around our priorities and understand what the senators are looking for, and then he takes the lead in his House doing the same for the Assembly. Unfortunately, before he was able to move his measure, we had COVID. And basically all conversation shut down. The assumption was that the general fund was going to take a pretty big hit, and we would not have the revenue needed to make the investments that we were looking at. And that was really disappointing, because just before then, the governor's office began to weigh in and suggest that they would be open to those types of investments, which is exactly what we need. A general obligation bond, very much like the budget, requires all three houses to identify their priorities and come to the negotiating table. So it was really, when COVID hit, the governor's office absolutely shut down conversations. We tried to keep them going for just a bit, and it was clear that we were going to get nowhere. So the measure was shelved then. We introduced it again last session as SB 45. This time, Mr. Portantino was the lead author, and something quite different happened. We were again moving our measure through the Senate, identifying our priorities, which honestly, shift, if we see a bigger fire year and we identify investments that we need to see there, or if we see, flood drought like we've seen the past couple of years, we definitely revamp kind of our priorities to deal with not only recent funding, but also where we think the voters would be. So we began reshaping that measure. And unlike the previous year, where we had to put our efforts on hold because of COVID, this year we were able to shelve our efforts because the general fund was so robust. We were able to get traction in getting some of the funding we were asking for through the general fund, which I know you guys are all very familiar with natural resources funding, and know that does, general fund revenue to fund natural resources, things like, restoration, land acquisition, operations and maintenance, all the things that we care about in our wildlands. To get general fund revenue for that was relatively unheard of. So we, of course, jumped at the opportunity to get that funding and saw what the governor was touting as a $10 billion investment in climate change. And that includes both the mitigation and the adaptation. So a lot of that money was slated to go to zero emission vehicles and infrastructure, et cetera. But a lot of it was going to places like, WCB, Fish and Wildlife, Coastal Conservancy, our other conservancies as well, to do all the good work that we were trying to get funded through the bond. So that was all really great. We celebrated that success and know that it's simply a down payment on the need And we know that, for example, every dollar we spend on an activity like clearing brush in some of these areas has a $6 return on investment when it comes to wildfire prevention. So coming into this year, knowing that the budget wasn't going to be as robust as we've seen in previous years, Senator Allen began talking with his Senate colleagues again about reintroducing a climate bond. And very excitedly, the governor also mentioned it in his budget announcement on January 10th. And then Mr. Garcia reintroduced his measure. So once again, we have all three parties excited about talking about and planning for a natural resources and climate bond. So Senator Allen, along with a group of his colleagues, including Mr. Portantino, Mr. Stern, Mr. Becker, and Mr. Dodd, have all reintroduced the climate bond this year here in the Senate. That bill number is SB 867. So we're very excited. If you looked it up right now, it would look very vague. Since we did not articulate the priorities coming out of the gate, we really wanted to get a sense from our allies here in the Senate, but also get a better sense from the governor's office and NGOs like all of you on how we wanted to revamp the priorities coming out of the robust general fund previous years. So we've introduced that measure. We are very excited. I do want to take a moment to speak a little bit about the process that is going to go through and some of the unknowns that we have in front of us. So first, we need to acknowledge that the governor's January budget did suggest some pretty significant cuts to the funding that had been allocated in the previous years. We, of course, don't want to see those programs cut. Don't know what's going to happen there. Leadership in both houses in the governor's office will have to look at the revenue coming into the state over the next couple of months and then make some tough funding decisions. So as that conversation is happening, we will also look at the outstanding needs in all of the categories that we've been looking at. So everything from fire to drought to flood, water supply, extreme heat, sea level rise, restoration, groundwater, you name it, looking at all those categories to identify the remaining funding needs. We are going to look very closely, however, at the governor's proposed cuts and try to see, is he proposing to cut funding that was in the out years? So for example, if WCB was getting $100 million a year for 5 years, if he's cutting just those last 2 years, that's something we can easily backfill with a general obligation bond. So we're going to be looking department by department at those types of details, but then also looking to ensure that if general fund dollars that we've appropriated over the past couple of years, we're going for operations and maintenance funding or the type of things we cannot fund through a bond. We want to make sure we are securing and safeguarding those investments, since who knows when we will ever get the kind of robust general fund that we got the last several years. So it is very unclear whether or not we'd ever get that kind of funding again. So we need to lock that funding in for sure. And then, we can use a general obligation bond to backfill the capital investments, land acquisitions, and other things that a bond could fund. So those are the types of ways we're looking at this bond a little differently than in previous bonds. And we do expect this new measure will build on the investments we've seen recently. So it's a slightly different lens. Again, we are counting on our partners in the Assembly with the leadership of Eduardo Garcia to identify the priorities coming through the Assembly, which is going to be really critical. And then we will do the same here in our House, identifying Senate priorities, expecting those two to come together And only one bond will move. Who knows if it's going to be the Assembly bill or the Senate bill? It doesn't really matter. It's a matter of just getting all the priorities in one place and then beginning negotiations with the governor's office to identify priorities coming out of the administration. I will say, looking at some of the cuts that were suggested in January, my sense is some of those suggestions were more political than programmatic. For example, we saw funding cut from sea level rise programs, which have been a huge priority here in the Senate. We've seen cuts to extreme heat funding. That was a huge priority of the Assembly. My guess is those things are done on purpose to ensure that we come forward and make those asks as part of the negotiation. This governor is not new to this. So I don't think that we should be too discouraged over the cuts that we saw in the budget. It's just, a beginning suggestion of where things will go from there. We don't know yet whether or not the bond will go on the primary ballot or the November ballot. If it goes, if the decision is made to put it on the primary ballot, we will have to move it this year, which will mean it'll move very quickly. If the decision is made to put it on the November ballot, we'll have till next June. So my sense, in having done this a couple of times, if we have till next June, we will take till next June, and big decisions won't be made till next spring. If the decision is to put it on the March ballot, obviously we'll see decisions made much, much sooner, which could be good. And all of that's going to be based on not just the polling that we're expecting to see in the next several weeks, but also the folks who work elections and understand what's going on which ballot and what that means for the voters and what kind of mood they're going to be in, and what kind of turnout we'll get. They will advise leadership on the decisions of which ballot would look better for a measure like this, and we'll go along with that. So I have no idea what that's going to look like. The other thing, the big question that I cannot answer, is the size of the bond. Obviously, we would hope for real, robust investments. I think this is the first time I have ever heard folks talking about more than $10 billion. I have no idea if that comes to fruition. It's clearly not based on need, since the need is astronomical. That it will be based on what the budget looks like, what revenues look like for the state, what the ballot's going to look like, what we feel like the voters can stomach. It doesn't, we know that we can easily allocate a $30 billion bond, and we still would not be meeting the climate and resiliency needs of the state. So it's not about need. It's not about, how good these projects are. It is about, the economic viability of the state and our debt level, and what the voters will actually pass. Putting a $30 billion bond on the ballot and watching it fail doesn't help anybody. So we'll be very cognizant of that as well. For our part, we're, as soon as you introduce a climate or natural resources bond, you get inundated with about 500 different requests for meetings, because everybody wants to tell you about their amazing project. And I've told folks, like, look, we're going to stipulate to how great these projects are. We know it. We know the need is astronomical in this state. We know that, everything from wetlands restoration up in the mountains to help recharge groundwater, all the way to dunes restoration. We know what the need is. And we know that we can get money out the door very quickly. So what we are suggesting for folks, like if you want to see, for example, water recycling investments, to really build that support amongst the members of the legislature, the bigger coalition you have of either senators or some members or both putting in an ask for something, the more likely we are going to be able to include that in the bond. We're not going to be able to include asks based from, that come from every NGO, and then think that we can also get the votes in the legislature to pass a measure like that. So we really need to kind of coalesce around priorities, which means, anything from, like I said, water recycling, where we want to see $500 million for extreme heat going to local communities. All of those things are really great investments. We need to have members of the legislature standing up for those priorities. So happy to get into more detail about that, ask specific questions. about, what we're looking at. Other budgeting items, as much as I know, it's still really unclear right now, but I'll answer what I can. Or if there are other questions related to anything else, happy to answer those too.
Great, thank you. That was a really good overview. I appreciate that. One thing I'm curious about though, so you talked about the bond and the legislative process. Bonds have also been passed because of signature gathering. And what's the difference? Can you explain
Yeah.
that to those of us that may not know?
Yeah. So ballot measures can go on the ballot in one of two ways. Either the legislature passes a measure and puts it before the voters, or a group of local voters can collect signatures and have it placed on the ballot. The latter is expensive because you have to gather signatures, and that's gotten more and more costly over time. So ideally, if you want to see something on the ballot, you would be able to get that passed through the legislature simply because it's cheaper. We have seen natural resources bonds passed both by the legislature and through signature gathering. I am feeling fairly confident that those who would normally do the signature gathering are reading the tea leaves and see that we do have traction in the legislature. Previously, when we weren't getting great signals from the governor's office, there was talk of gathering signatures. This time, I don't think it's going to be necessary. It's also worth noting, even if voters did decide to put a bond out and gather signatures and get it qualified for the ballot, there's a process now where the legislature gets one more at bat to review what has been qualified for the ballot and could, with the sign off of the ballot proponents, pass something either different or similar, etc. That would usually be a compromise. So for example, we did it this last year with plastics. We've done it with MICRA, which has to do with healthcare, where you did have interested parties put something on the ballot. The legislature came forward, negotiated a solution, and did it legislatively instead of moving forward with a ballot. Here, I think because the governor has signaled very early his support for a general obligation bond in this space, I think we'll see success running it through the legislature. And then we'll be able to save all that money that would otherwise go to signature gathering and could use that for the actual campaign.
Got it. And one question we had from Chris Morrill, who's outside the Southland group but participating today. The question is, what do we need to know about the natural resources and climate bond? Is there anything else in terms of details? It sounds like getting coalition letters in may be helpful at this point in terms
Yes.
of priorities.
Yes.
What type of feedback can you offer there?
I would say absolutely coalition letters are going to be key. And getting, again, support from members of the legislature. So depending on what it is your coalition is supporting, going to members that would share that as a priority and getting them to put in those asks. We're not quite sure what the timing is going to be, but we should it's safer to assume things will move fast. So having that outreach to members of the legislature sooner rather than later is going to be really key. I expect the caucuses to come together and begin identifying their priorities over the next couple of months. And you'll want, whatever it is you're looking for, like let's say you want to make sure that there's X amount of funding for the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. Fantastic. You'll want to go and get members to put in that ask, which means you've got to make the case to them about how important that funding is and what it could be used for. This way, when we're pushing, we're not the only ones pushing to get this funding, because, Senator Allen as one member isn't going to dictate solely what the bond looks like. It is going to reflect, initially the Senate bill will reflect the Senate's priorities and the Assembly bill will reflect the Assembly's priorities. So you need to get those members expressing your priorities, if that makes sense.
It does. And so it also sounds like, in addition to the coalition lobbying, is the Senate or Assembly side of things, would those be considered line items in the bond,
It
or?
depends, like, I don't know, like, so there's a spectrum. So the governor's office, when he came out in 2020 or 2019, whenever that was, with what his bond would look like, it was very vague. It was extremely vague. If he had his way, we would just cut him checks and let his administration spend the money as they see fit. Of course, that's what he would want. Mm, the Senate version definitely had more detail. And then the assembly version had even more detail. And they have line items for more specific projects than we do here. So for example, we won't spell out acquiring this parcel or that parcel. Our priorities have always been to, for Senator Allen, to get funding out to conservancies so they can acquire land. And carry out restoration activities. So we might not say, okay, we want to see, whatever, $10 billion for this project, but we would be working with, say, a conservancy to identify the priorities and projects that they think they can get out the door very quickly.
So that brings up an interesting question, and I'll pause here and just tell folks that if you have other questions, I've got a list going, but please feel free to drop them in the chat. And if we have time, I can get to them. What about places that don't have conservancies?
Yeah.
How does that fit into the mix?
So that's where the WCB has been really critical. If it were up to me, every part of the state would have a conservancy, because it is, we've seen great success with our conservancies working with local community groups to get funding out the door to identify priorities. It's just a really great relationship. But for the places of the state that don't have conservancies, we've relied on the Wildlife Conservation Board, and they are extraordinary at being able to move money. They can identify priorities and work with community groups very quickly. And that's been really, really good to see. We've given them a ton of money over the past couple of years to do the types of restoration and resiliency work that this bond will continue to do. Yeah, I think they've been very successful in picking up those parts of the state.
Got it. And what about kind of topical areas? So for example, I know we have folks on the call today from the statewide wildlife corridor working group. We also have folks here today interested in NCCPs and HCPs. Could there potentially be generic line items? So it's not a specific wildlife corridor, a specific NCCP, but just, hey, we're going to dedicate this much in a dollar figure to increasing funding for NCCPs or wildlife corridors.
We've seen that over the past 4 years as we've been putting these bonds together. And I expect we'll see it again. I think we'll see that level of specificity. I don't think we'll see, X amount for this wildlife crossing or that wildlife crossing or this NCCP or that. But I do think we'll probably see specificity for those types of categories. Again, I'm not sure how much the governor's office will push back on that and how much they'll just want to say $2 billion to the Natural Resources Agency for all these types of activities, right?
Okay.
And then you might see wildlife crossings, NCCPs, et cetera, all listed, but without a breakdown in the funding pots. We'll definitely push for more specificity. But it'll depend. And even if we don't have that specificity, which I really feel is necessary to get the votes both in the legislature and probably amongst the voters, even if we don't see that specificity here, it's just kicking the can, because when the voters pass the measure, knock on wood, it'll then be, we'll then have to appropriate the money through the budget process. So it's simply moving those discussions to later. And then, having the governor put out a budget saying, okay, that $2 billion you gave natural resources, this is how we're going to spend it. So hopefully we make some of those decisions up front.
Got it. And are there any pitfalls we should be aware of related to the bond?
I would say, gosh, always, right? We've seen this, this is our third go at it. We did see success last session, the last couple of years, where we were able to get general obligation funding, but none of these things are a sure bet. As much as, I feel very confident in the support we have right now, none of them are a sure bet. I would say it is still incumbent upon all of us to make the case that the level of investments we're contemplating are a huge priority for the state. And it might seem like a lot of money to even talk about putting $10 billion on the ballot, which I have no idea if we'll get that high or if it'll be way higher or way less. I really don't have a sense. Uh, um, but we know that the need is great, and we know if we don't make these investments now, they're just more costly later. So these are the types of messaging that we need everybody to be getting into the legislature. There are other priorities, that are really important as well. Folks are talking about a housing bond and other investments that are also critically important to our state. We don't want to be waylaid because of those priorities. We want to move in tandem with them. And we know that natural resources gets the short end of the stick all too often.
It does, unfortunately. So 2 questions heading over to the budget. Both of these are from Daniel Glusenkamp, who's on the line today. What strategies could be considered to ensure that the final budget restores funding for things like coastal adaptation, protection of imperiled intertidal, and nature-based solutions that enhance biodiversity?
It's like I said, it's hard to know. Well, it's hard to know two things. One, how deep the cuts this year are going to have to be. I think this governor is typically pretty conservative when he puts his budgets together, as he probably should be. And we will have a better sense as we go through the spring on what the state revenues are going to be. If they do turn up short, everyone's going to have to take a haircut. Natural resources will be no different. So really, I urge us to look deeply, if that's the case, and identify those things that we can never fund through a bond. Like, it could be another decade before we see general fund revenue like we did the past 2 years. We want to protect that O&M funding that we were able to receive with everything we've got. You cannot use bonds for that. It's been a really tough, it's been a hurdle. For example, it's a priority for Senator Allen. He's, loves state parks, have wanted to see an increase acreage in our state parks. He'd love to see more land acquisition. And really, the state parks department has been less than enthusiastic about that, because every acre they purchase, they have to try to figure out how to operate, and they have no funding for that. So it's been a real uphill battle for us. So, in looking at the revenue we've had the past couple of years and looking at the revenue we're going to have for this next budget going forward, I would suggest that our priority really needs to be to protect and enhance O&M, and then, identify if there are cuts that we have to sustain, ensuring we've got those backfilled in the bond.
Excellent. So similar in nature to that last question, there were deep cuts for mapping and biodiversity assessments in the budget. That seems really important in terms of a preliminary step to investigating something. Do you have any insights as to why that occurred?
No, not in what the governor was thinking, because those are, obviously mapping is the first step to 30 by 30. We need to understand what we've got, and then understand, the priority areas for conservation. Hard to say. It's indefensible, for those cuts. I think these are the types of things where we need to identify what our priorities are. And that seems like something that we should really be advocating for get restored.
So that could be a coalition takeaway, is to lobby the governor on reinvesting in that phase 1 of
Right.
30. All right. So I'm aware of the time. Let's see if we can get to a question or two in the chat here.
And I'll put my contact information in the chat too.
Perfect.
If folks have
So
other questions.
appreciate that. One question in here from Claire Schlotterbeck. Given the reluctance of state parks to buy land over the last 13 years, are they going to be given any money? And I'm guessing this is related to the bond.
I'll tell you, it is a priority for Senator Allen. Absolutely.
All right. So it feels like there's a lot of potential letters that could go in on a variety of topics. Good to know. Let's see, looking through other questions. For Escondido Conservancy or Escondido Creek Conservancy, asks, is there a formula that the governor's office uses to determine appropriate levels of bonds, debt to the size of the economy? I mean, how are those numbers calculated?
Yeah, I'm sure Department of Finance and their fleet of economists do have that kind of information um, that they look at. But those things change when our GDP grows, our credit changes, all of those things change what that formula would look like. Really, it's going to be the size of the budget, which has grown over time in the past couple of years, has been really robust. And then the voters' ability to stomach debt. So, like for example, when we started this 4 years ago, we were told that $10 billion was a hard line. Voters would never cross $10 billion. Like if they saw more than $10 billion on a bond, it was too expensive for them. And so that was the ceiling that we were operating under. We do expect to get polling in the next several weeks to give us an initial sense of what that'll look like, which I'm very excited to see. It's still very early. Even if we're going to be on a March ballot, it's still pretty early. So things will change over time.
And I think a good follow-up question to this, there's no name associated with it, simply says Zoom user, but has there been any polling to understand how likely the measure will pass once it gets on the ballot? And even more so, I would reflect back the number that you're proposing in the bond. Is there research ongoing to figure out what voters are willing to tolerate?
Yep. We've got supporters that we're working with going out into the field to begin to get that data. And again, we'll have to follow up, and our caucus too will do some polling to help both shape the size, but also the priorities that are in the bond.
Perfect. See if there's any toxic projects that people really don't want to see in there versus ones that they really do support.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, like given what we've seen this year with the floods, whereas we might have led off with fire in previous years, maybe we lead off with water this year, right? So then you see that, that kind of distinction that would help ensure that we get voter support for what we're looking to do.
Great. Well, I so appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. And for everyone watching, know that I said this will be posted on the Hills for Everyone YouTube channel. So watch for that. And we'll stop the recording and then head over into the Southland 30 by 30. So folks not in the Southland can go ahead and log off at this point unless you really want to hear what we're up to. But thanks, Tina.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Thanks.